Welcome to the deep dive. If you're prepping for a strategic meeting or trying to catch up on medical tech, or you're just someone who loves understanding how the world actually works, you are in the right place.
Absolutely.
You are the learner, and we have an incredible mission for you today. We are unpacking basically a tectonic shift in the worlds of medicine and technology. We're talking about the EU Artificial Intelligence Act.
Right. And to do that, we're looking specifically through the lens of a new, um, highly detailed compliance guide. It was published by Validfor and authored by their CEO, Omer Siemon.
Yeah.
And it's essentially a roadmap for how the world's very first comprehensive AI law is fundamentally rewriting the playbook for the pharmaceutical industry.
Completely rewriting it.
Yeah, and we need to establish the stakes right away here because this is a global mandate. The sources make it crystal clear.
Right.
Whether your pharmaceutical company is headquartered in Berlin, Boston, or Bangalore, if your AI touches patients or data within the European Union, you are in scope. You're on the hook.
Which is huge. For the last few years, the integration of AI into healthcare has felt, I don't know, incredibly chaotic.
Oh, totally.
It's been this rapid expansion of prospectors rushing in with new algorithms, kind of like the Wild West.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Right, with very few rules.
Yeah.
But reading through this Validfor guide, it completely changes how you view regulation. Because I used to think of new regulations like a sheriff coming to town to just lock everybody up.
Right, the bad guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now the first major sheriff has arrived in town and their badge has global jurisdiction. And it feels more like the introduction of modern building codes, in architecture. You don't inspect a skyscraper by just looking at the finished paint job. You inspect the blueprints, you stress test the steel, and you do geological surveys before a single brick is even laid.
What's fascinating here is that that's a much more accurate way to look at it.
Yeah.
The Validfor Guide doesn't present the EU AI Act as a roadblock to innovation. Omer Siemon specifically calls it a guardrail. It's the structural integrity that allows you to build a skyscraper taller.
Because if it's just glass.
Exactly. If you build a 100-story tower out of glass and just hope for the best, a strong wind is going to take it down.
Yeah.
So the EU is stepping in to ensure that the AI revolution in healthcare has a solid foundation rather than just being, fast and structurally unsound.
Okay, so let's look at the blueprints then. How does this new sheriff actually operate? How do they inspect this proverbial skyscraper?
Well,
Because they aren't just slapping a single blanket rule across every single piece of technology, right?
yeah.
If you use an AI to schedule meetings, that shouldn't be regulated the same way as an AI that doses chemotherapy.
No, definitely not.
The guide explains that the law categorizes all these suspects, all these tools, using a tiered, risk-based approach.
Yes, but it's less of a simple categorization and more of a series of regulatory tripwires.
The EU AI Act places systems into a risk pyramid. For pharma companies, understanding exactly where your software sits on this pyramid is the difference between normal operations and facing massive, potentially crippling regulatory obligations.
Wow. Okay, let's start at the very top of that pyramid, the absolute no-go zone. They call it prohibited AI, which carries an unacceptable risk.
Right.
This means the AI is banned outright. Now, in pharmaceutical context, the guide notes this probably won't apply to standard day-to-day operations like drug manufacturing.
Right, usually not.
But there is a massive warning here about aggressive marketing or behavioral nudging.
That's the tripwire right there.
Yeah.
Anything that crosses the line into subliminal manipulation is prohibited.
Subliminal.
Yeah. If an AI system is designed to bypass human agency or manipulate patient behavior in a way that exploits vulnerabilities,
Like what?
well, say you're using hyper-targeted, emotionally manipulative prompts to keep a patient hooked on a non-essential medication. That is off the table entirely.
There's no conformity assessment you can pass. There's no paperwork you can file to make it okay. It is just banned.
Man, so if subliminal manipulation is completely banned, what happens to the AI tools that are, genuinely trying to help but have life or death consequences?
All right.
Where do those fit? Because that leads us to the next tier down, the high-risk AI systems. And reading the guide, this seems to be the danger zone where the pharmaceutical industry really needs to pay attention.
It is the danger zone, absolutely.
The guide highlights two specific examples. AI algorithms used in CDSS, which are clinical decision support systems,
Right.
software that helps doctors make diagnostic choices. And then AI classified as SAMD, which stands for software as a medical device, meaning the app itself acts as a diagnostic or treatment tool.
And if you find your tool falling into that high-risk tier, you can't just deploy it and hope for the best.
Right.
The obligations are incredibly heavy. You're required to perform what the EU calls rigorous conformity assessments.
I want to pause there because conformity assessment sounds like, I don't know, a generic piece of paperwork.
Yeah, it sounds boring.
Right. But what does that actually look like in practice? How do you actually assess an algorithm?
It's basically a full-scale audit of your entire data pipeline. You have to prove high-quality data governance.
Okay.
That means tracing exactly where every piece of training data came from, verifying its integrity, and proving it wasn't poisoned or compromised in any way.
Wow.
You also must maintain meticulous, detailed technical documentation that outlines the exact mathematical architecture of the model.
That sounds intense.
It is. You have to log everything before you can even think about going to market.
And then below that heavy burden, we have the limited risk category. These are things like patient support chatbots or bots handling basic queries from healthcare professionals.
Exactly.
According to the guide, the main obligation here is just the transparency principle. You just have to clearly inform the user, hey, you are talking to an AI right now.
Yep. Just be transparent.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where my brain immediately sees a massive loophole.
Loophole in what sense?
Let's say a pharma company uses a simple chatbot on their website. Totally limited risk, right?
Yes.
It's just there to answer basic FAQ stuff like clinic hours or generic drug interactions. But patients are human beings. They're going to type in their specific symptoms. They're going to ask for medical advice. What happens if that limited risk chatbot accidentally gives something resembling a diagnosis? Does it suddenly cross this invisible line and become a high-risk clinical decision support system? Because suddenly, it's acting like one.
I'd push back on calling it a loophole because it's actually the exact scenario compliance officers are sweating over right now.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And it highlights the core mechanism of the entire regulation, which is intended use.
Intended use.
Exactly. The risk classification dictates your entire compliance burden, so it forces pharmaceutical companies to be incredibly, almost painfully precise about the intended use of their AI.
I see.
You cannot just release a general-purpose, open-ended generative chatbot into the wild and claim it's limited risk if there's a highly foreseeable chance it starts acting like a medical device.
So how do you stop it? You can't control what a patient types into a text box.
No, you can't control the patient, but you can control the architecture of the bot. You have to build the guardrails physically into the software itself.
How does that work?
This means hard-coding semantic filters. If the natural language processor detects symptom-related keywords, the bot must be programmed to automatically shut down that line of inquiry and redirect the patient to a human doctor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have to mathematically prove to the regulators that the bot is incapable of crossing that invisible line.
And if you can't?
If you can't prove that, then you have to validate that simple chatbot as a high-risk system from day one with all the massive audits that entails.
So you have to declare exactly what the tool is going to do and build the physical walls to ensure it cannot do anything else.
Yep.
The days of, let's just launch this and see what the AI teaches itself to do, are completely over in this industry.
Entirely over. You have to tell the regulators the exact parameters of the software's capability.
Okay, so if that's how the building codes work conceptually, unacceptable, high risk, limited risk,
Right.
let's apply this to the actual construction of the building. Let's look at how a drug actually moves through its life cycle under these new rules.
Good idea.
Because the guide makes it clear that the risk levels shift depending on what phase of development you're in. Let's start at the very beginning, R&D and drug discovery.
Well, this is an area where the guide actually highlights some breathing room for innovation.
Oh, good, yeah.
If you're using AI purely for early-stage molecular modeling, using algorithms to predict protein folding or simulate chemical reactions, that generally falls under the lower risk categories.
Makes sense.
The mechanism here is simple. There's no direct human interaction yet. The AI is just crunching massive amounts of chemical data on a secure server.
It's just advanced math at that point.
Right. Though the guide points out that basic data governance still applies. You can't use stolen or completely unverified data sets.
Oh, right.
But the heavy regulatory boot isn't on your neck quite yet. However, the moment you move out of the lab and into the next phase, the entire risk profile flips.
Clinical trials, because now you are involving actual human lives.
Exactly.
The guide notes that using AI in clinical trials faces intense microscopic scrutiny, especially if you're using an algorithm to analyze patient data or match specific patients to trials.
Yes.
And the main hurdle here, according to the source material, is the requirement around bias and fairness.
And this is a major compliance hurdle because of how AI models actually learn. An AI model is only as smart as the historical data it's fed.
Right.
If you're using an AI to filter and select candidates for a new cardiovascular drug trial, the EU AI Act requires you to mathematically prove that your algorithm does not skew its selections based on demographic factors like gender, ethnicity, or age.
But how do you mathematically prove fairness? I mean, it's easy to say make sure the AI is fair, but how does a compliance officer actually demonstrate that to a regulator in Brussels?
It comes down to statistical parity and rigorous stress testing. You can't just look at the code and say, looks fine to me.
Yeah.
You have to run the AI through validation sets. These are essentially holdout data sets that represent diverse, real-world populations.
Okay.
You test the algorithm's failure rate or rejection rate across these different synthetic demographic groups.
So you're looking for patterns of exclusion.
Exactly. If the math shows that your algorithm is quietly excluding elderly patients at a disproportionately higher rate than younger patients, you have a massive compliance violation.
Wow.
You have to tune the algorithm until the statistical parity metrics align with the regulatory requirements.
So you can't just blame the algorithm and say, well, it noticed a pattern we didn't. You are fundamentally responsible for auditing the math to ensure it aligns with the trial's parameters.
100%.
Which brings us to the post-market phase. The drug has passed the trials, it's out in the world, and companies use pharmacovigilance, or PV, to monitor its safety long-term.
Yes, pharmacovigilance is the ongoing tracking of adverse events once a drug is public. And pharma companies use AI heavily here.
Right.
They use natural language processing to scan tens of thousands of adverse event reports, emails, and doctor's notes, looking for hidden safety signals that a human might miss.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Because the EU AI Act has a very strict rule for this specific phase, no black box AI.
Right.
The logic of the system has to be completely transparent and explainable to regulators. Imagine a brilliant, world-renowned doctor, an absolute medical genius.
Okay, I'm picturing them.
This doctor looks at a patient's chart and correctly diagnoses a 1 in a million incredibly subtle side effect that is going to save that patient's life. But when the hospital board asks this genius doctor, how did you know? What was the specific indicator in the blood work? The doctor just shrugs and says, I don't really know. I just felt it. I just looked at the data and the answer appeared.
Right.
Now, imagine the European Union stepping in and banning that exact doctor from ever practicing medicine again. Why? Because they couldn't explain how they got the right answer.
I love that analogy. It's spot on. The black box problem is one of the most fascinating technical challenges in machine learning right now.
Yeah.
A black box is a neural network where you feed millions of data points in and you get a highly accurate answer out. But the pathways the data took inside the network are so incredibly complex and multi-layered that even the software engineers who built it cannot fully map how it arrived at that specific conclusion.
Which is exactly like our genius doctor. The AI might perfectly diagnose a rare reaction, but when you ask it to show its work, it can't.
Exactly.
The EU is firmly telling the AI, we don't care how brilliant your predictive modeling is. If you cannot explicitly map your logic, you are illegal.
And we really need to understand the why behind this rule. Why do regulators care if the AI is a black box, as long as it successfully flags a dangerous side effect?
Yeah, why do they?
It's because the demand for explainability is the only way to protect human oversight. Let's say your pharmacovigilance AI flags a sudden, tiny spike in liver toxicity related to a new drug.
Okay.
Regulators and human medical experts need to know exactly why the AI flagged it. Did it weigh a certain enzyme heavily? Did it notice a geographic cluster?
They need the reasoning.
Right. If the AI cannot output a clear, logical map of its reasoning, human experts cannot independently verify the signal. The EU AI Act is built on the fundamental principle that a human must always remain in the loop, fully capable of verifying the machine's logic.
Show your work, or you don't get to participate.
Exactly.
And because the EU is forcing companies to show their work on such a microscopic mathematical level, global pharma companies are having to completely rewire their internal operations.
Oh, they're scrambling.
Which transitions us perfectly to the final, most practical piece of the Validfor guide, the action plan. Because these rules are not some distant sci-fi concept.
No, the enforcement timelines are staggered, but they are beginning to roll out right now. And this immediate pressure is what triggers the Brussels effect.
Yes, we mentioned this briefly at the start, the global scope of this law. The Brussels effect is this fascinating economic reality.
Right.
The European Union is such a massive, lucrative market that whatever stringent regulations they pass inevitably become the default global standard.
It's just economics.
Yeah, it is simply too expensive and too complicated for a company in Boston or Tokyo to build one highly regulated AI system for European patients and a totally separate, less regulated AI system for the rest of the world. They just adopt the strictest rules globally to streamline their operations.
Which means every major pharma player on Earth is currently looking at this action plan. Omer Simon's guide lays out a very clear, highly technical playbook for companies caught in this net.
Okay, what's step one?
Step one is the inventory. A company must create a comprehensive, exhaustive registry of all AI and machine learning tools used across their entire organization.
All of them.
All of them. And the guide specifies this means both in regulated GXP environments. Those are the strict, heavily monitored areas dealing with good manufacturing and clinical practices, and in non-regulated environments.
So what does this all mean? I really have to push back on this first step because conceptually, an inventory makes sense. But practically,
It's tough.
think about you, the listener, right now. If you're a software developer listening to this and you just pulled a snippet of open source AI code off GitHub to help write a script faster, you just introduced an AI tool to your company.
That's true.
Is it genuinely realistic for a massive pharmaceutical company with 50,000 global employees to successfully map every single AI tool they use? It sounds like trying to count every individual drop of water in a swimming pool.
It does.
Especially when an employee in the marketing department might just be using a generic, off-the-shelf generative AI tool on their web browser to write emails. How do you inventory the ocean?
This raises an important question, and it's the multi-million-dollar question. You're describing the nightmare of shadow IT.
Shadow IT.
Yeah, which refers to any software or tools being used by employees without explicit official IT approval. Is it incredibly difficult to map? Absolutely.
Right.
But the Validfor guide makes the stakes terrifyingly clear. Failure to do so risks an unacceptable risk violation. Regulators do not care how big your company is.
Ignorance of the algorithm is not a legal defense.
Exactly. So how do companies actually do this? They can't just send out a company-wide survey and hope people tell the truth.
No, of course not.
They're having to deploy automated network scanning tools that detect AI signatures in network traffic. They're demanding software bills of materials from every single third-party vendor they use. Oh yeah, forcing vendors to disclose if there is any hidden machine learning embedded deep in a standard SaaS product. It is a massive forensic operation.
Wow.
Because if a regulator audits your company and finds a high-risk AI operating in your clinical trial data pipeline that your chief compliance officer didn't even know existed, the fines and the reputational damage will be catastrophic.
Which makes step 2 of the action plan absolutely critical. Classify.
Right.
Once you use those forensic tools to build that massive inventory list, you have to map every single tool against that risk pyramid we discussed earlier. You have to isolate your high-risk systems immediately because those are the structural weaknesses in your skyscraper.
And that flows directly into step 3, the gap analysis. Yeah. This is where companies have to look at their current internal protocols, specifically their CSA, or computer software assurance practices.
Right.
CSA is essentially the modern protocol for proving that a piece of software reliably does exactly what it claims to do. Companies have to compare their current CSA practices against the new EU requirements.
And what are the main gaps they're usually hunting for? Where do companies usually fall short?
The guide highlights 2 massive blind spots: data governance and human oversight.
Okay.
Traditionally, software validation was about checking boxes to ensure a program didn't crash. But the EU AI Act demands continuous lifecycle monitoring.
Meaning?
You have to prove that there's a defined process for a human to override the AI at any moment. If your current assurance protocols don't explicitly document how a human can pull the plug on the AI, that is a gap you have to close immediately.
It's a complete paradigm shift from does the software work to can we control the software when it works in ways we didn't expect.
That's a great way to put it. But I don't want to highlight the silver lining in the Validfor guide.
Oh, there's a silver lining.
Yes, there's a flip side to all this regulatory panic. Integrating AI governance into your existing validation frameworks right now isn't just a defensive move to avoid fines. It is actually a strategy to turn compliance into a massive competitive advantage.
How so? Because usually more regulation just means slower timelines and more bureaucracy.
Think back to your skyscraper metaphor. If your company builds a clean, transparent, fully validated AI pipeline with a solid foundation, you understand the exact parameters of your tools.
Right.
That means when a new breakthrough in machine learning happens, you can deploy it safely and bring drugs to market faster.
Ah, I see.
Meanwhile, your competitor, who didn't map their shadow IT and built their tower on sand, is going to be bogged down in years of regulatory audits and redesigns. You can drive the car much faster when you know exactly how strong the guardrails are.
You can trust the speed because you've verified the brakes.
Exactly.
So to synthesize all of this for you listening, the central takeaway from Omer Siemens' Validfor guide is that the days of unregulated frontier-style AI experimentation in the healthcare sector are officially over.
They're done.
The blueprints are mandatory now. The EU AI Act is establishing a rigorous, tiered risk system to ensure that as this incredible technology revolutionizes drug discovery, clinical trials, and patient safety, it remains structurally sound, fundamentally ethical, and entirely transparent.
Yep.
It is forcing the industry to move from accidental innovation to intentional architecture.
You must map exactly what tools you're using, you must mathematically prove their parameters, and you must design systems that ensure human beings always have the final say.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over on your own, something that builds on everything we've just unpacked.
Right.
We spent a lot of time talking about the pharmacovigilance phase and how the EU AI Act strictly mandates that high-risk AI cannot be a black box.
Right.
Its logic must be entirely explainable to human regulators so we can verify its reasoning and oversee it. But as deep learning neural networks become exponentially more advanced, as they start analyzing billions of complex biological data points simultaneously, discovering microscopic correlations and potential cures that we couldn't even dream of.
They get way more complicated.
Right, they inherently become more difficult for the human brain to comprehend. The math simply outpaces our cognitive capacity to map it.
It does.
So the question I leave you with is this. Will this strict, unyielding demand for human explainability inadvertently stall the use of the most advanced, potentially life-saving neural networks in medicine? Are we going to be forced to reject the cure for a disease simply because the machine's brilliance has become too complex for our own minds to fully decode?
That is a fascinating question.
It's a slightly murky landscape ahead, but that's exactly why we're here to unpack it with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep challenging the assumptions, and most importantly, keep questioning the information around you. Catch you next time.